It's the Scholar General, and I'm over here in Wuxi, China, and it's time for another Q&A with the coach. So obviously many of you will realize that I'm imitating Ramsey Dewey. So Ramsey Dewey is a famous pro fighter, and he runs an MMA gym in Shanghai, China. And he has a quite big YouTube channel. He talks about all kinds of things related to martial arts and interesting topics. And recently he made a video where he's talking about the problems of weapons training and how you can never actually simulate real weapons fighting in sparring. And obviously I have a lot of thoughts on this issue, and I thought this would be a great opportunity to kind of give my input and add to the conversation. Make sure you go watch Ramsey's video so you have an idea of everything his argument encompasses. But the general idea is basically that weapons training is never really about, like, you can never actually simulate weapons training because weapons are lethal weapons. That's why they're called weapons. Sound a little redundant here. To begin with, I just want to say that overall, yes, I agree with this premise that you can't actually realistically simulate, let's say, for example, swords. I'm all about sword on this channel. You can never really simulate what it's like to be in a sword fight without being in a real sword fight because of the nature of, mortal combat with swords. And that's part of the reason why I don't really call myself a swordsman, and I don't hold any delusions about, winning a sword fight in real life or ever wanting to fight with a real sword in real life, because that's way too dangerous. But swords are awesome. I love swords, so I'm going to keep practicing it. And I think that there are a few things that we can consider if we want to talk about how we can possibly know how people were sword fighting in the past, and how we can potentially embody some of the techniques and movement of people of the past when they were sword fighting. So the first thing I want to say about this idea that you can never really spar in a way that simulates lethal weapon combat is that this is a problem that is not new. In the past, they also had this problem, right? They can't just take all their soldiers and make them fight each other with sharp swords all the time, because you quickly lose soldiers. They all kill each other. And in the past, what they did was they kind of did what we did. They would train with safer versions like sticks, and in China we have an accounts of they get these stabs and they wrap cloths around the end of it with some chalk, and then they see who can stab each other to simulate spear fighting, things like that. So this isn't a new problem at all. And the only thing that we don't have that they have in the past is they have the actual experience, right? So they have their gym time whenever they're training safely, and then they have their actual, real combat. And we don't have the advantage of practicing the real combat part. Thankfully we don't, because who wants to do that? But the question is, how can we access some of the knowledge that they would have gained from fighting with things like sharp swords and real battlefield weapons? And one place you can kind of look for ideas about this problem is modern militaries. So modern militaries also have this problem. They're obviously not going to throw their soldiers in real firefights to train them how to do firefights. Yet, they've still developed tools and a methodology to at least reach a certain level of competence in firefights that soldiers have never actually experienced. So I'll touch on that a little bit more later, but first I actually want to talk about my own personal approach as to how I attempt to kind of recreate martial arts, mostly of the late Ming and Qing periods. The first thing you have to do is a lot of research, and I don't just mean dojo lore where some master says something and then you're just like, oh, now I know the truth. Obviously, I mean real proper research, and real research involves real sources. So you have to look at primary sources. You don't just look at a primary source, you have to understand the context of sources. You also have to understand your own biases and lenses that you're using to look at a source. There's a lot of tools and methodologies involved in properly making use of source material, and you have to do that. In addition to that, I think that many people underestimate or don't quite understand what a source can be or is, right? A source is not limited to just a text, right? Obviously, I love to look at manuals. I look at the Chinese manuals all the time, but the swords themselves are a form of source. And if we're going to be trying to understand how people fought with real swords, we have to know a lot about the real swords. Otherwise, we're just playing with some new thing that's not actually the same and not representative of what the past was at all. In addition to that, Chinese martial arts, is a living tradition. So we have practitioners and masters alive today. I also view the living tradition as another form of source. So it's not just texts, it's not just the antiques, it's also the living tradition itself. And each of these types of sources has to have their own caveats and problems and nuances about how you can go about understanding them and using them. So after you understand quite a bit about the historical martial art you're trying to recreate, there's a couple things that you should do. Number one, you have to learn how to cut with a sword, because imagine if modern militaries never train their soldiers to shoot at the range and they just play with the guns and maybe they do some airsoft, but they never actually shoot at things. That's kind of what it's like for people who swing sticks around but don't ever actually cut with a sharp sword. I mean, I'm kind of being Captain Obvious here, but if you want to learn how to cut things with a sword, you gotta cut things with a sword. Now, in addition to that, the next step is to do some type of sparring, right? So here's my sparring sword, right? It's lots of fun, very nice. Now, the thing about sparring is that, of course, every kind of sparring that you could possibly do with a blunt steel sword or foam sword or wooden sword or any kind of training tool will not be the same as with sharps. It's just a fact. And the key, I don't think, is to therefore throw all the sparring in the trash, because that gets even worse. If you're just swinging around things with floppy kung fu swords all the time, then you're getting even further away from actual historical fighting. The key, I think, is to, number one, try to get your training tools to simulate the real weapons as closely as possible. At least in that, the ways that you're moving the weapon will be within the realm of possibility of how they could have moved the weapon in the past. In addition to that, I think that many people get stuck in a game of sparring where it's like, I'm going to win by hitting the guy and I'm not going to get hit, and it's good, you need to practice that. But I think that the goal of our training should not be to necessarily be very good and a super skillful in one rule set. It's good to be good in a rule set, but I think the main goal is actually to be a well-rounded fencer who can adapt to all kinds of rule sets and role-playing situations even, and do well, right? So you should have some just, go against random weapons sometimes, or you should one person should act extremely aggressive, almost suicidal, and then the other person should just be super defensive, and vice versa. You gotta experiment and play with the rule sets of whatever kind of sparring you're doing. And of course, it's a game, right? It's a glorified game of tag where I'm trying to hit them with my stick and I don't want to be hit by their stick. But the more you can adapt your skills to many different types of sparring, then the better off you would be, I believe, in an actual real-life sword fight. So one analogy here would be kind of like grappling or even MMA, where you can train one martial art and you get super good at it. However, the looser rule set of MMA means that you're going to need to kind of do a bunch of different things. You shouldn't just train in one art. And that also even goes for within grappling styles too, right? You can be a really good judoka. I love judo. You can be a really good judoka, but it has limitations, right? And at a certain point, you need to start experimenting with other rule sets and to develop as a more well-rounded grappler. And a more well-rounded grappler is going to be better able, in my opinion, to transfer to, let's say, a self-defense situation that involves grappling. Then I want to kind of move on to this last idea, which this is a part where I'm kind of shooting off the cuff, and this is not way outside my realm of expertise, but I still think that there's something here, and let me know in the comments down below if you think I'm totally off base here. But if we're thinking about modern militaries and warriors of the past and how we can ever simulate it, the real challenge that you face is the fact that your life is never at risk when you're training. At least I really hope it's not. If it is, you really need to get away from that space. But you don't want a place where you're risking your life while you're training. However, in a real sword fight or in a real firefight, you obviously are risking your life, right? And the question is, how can you possibly prepare someone for that situation? If we think about sword fights in the past, then most of the time, if you're close enough to cut the person, they're close enough to cut you. So your life is inherently at risk. I mean, to begin with, I think that many people who are going to enter into a violent encounter where their life is inherently at risk are probably going to have some type of altered state of mind. And it could just be that they have different brain chemistry, and there's some pretty crazy people out there who seem like they have a death wish. I mean, people who like climb cliffs without any tethers and stuff. So you can always get some atypical behaviors from certain people. It's also possible that individuals could have ideological motivations for engaging in violence, and we can see this sometimes. I don't want to talk about all the examples, there's a lot of them, but it's fairly clear to me that ideology can play a role in getting someone into a state of mind where they're willing to die in order to kill. Aside from this, if we look at the military, I think that in general the soldiers usually are not killing people because they necessarily want to go kill those people, but most of the time, if you look at like interviews with soldiers and things, a lot of the time they do what they do because of their comrades, right? They're part of a very tight-knit group, and that group, people are willing to sacrifice themselves in order to help that group survive. And a huge part of military training is not about, teaching you how to shoot a rifle. They do that, and they do play some war games, and they do, airsoft or whatever type of simulated combat. But what really makes them soldiers is kind of the breakdown of their identity, and they're molded into a new identity that's a group identity. And that's what really allows them to go out and risk their lives. Now, is this something that we can directly apply to our training nowadays? And whenever we're just kind of hitting each other with steel sticks? I personally don't think so. I don't have a good answer for you there. But I do think that it's important for us to consider the realities of humans and warfare and violence if we want to understand the violence of the past, right? That's an obvious point. Aside from that, I think that as martial artists, even though if you're really paying attention, you should understand the reality and almost the futility of actually preparing for any kind of, real life self-defense or life and death situation. I think that every serious martial artist, or many people, should actually just consider what are the situations or what are the things that they might be willing to risk their lives for. Because, that's just useful in life in general. And you have to, and I also think that if you never consider those things, then you're less likely to actually be able to act on them if a situation came. So that kind of wraps up my thoughts about this topic. I hope that you guys go easy on me about stepping out of my wheelhouse and straying from my expertise there towards the end. But I look forward to hearing all your comments and what you guys think down below. And I just gotta say to Ramsey Dewey, if you made it this far in the video, we should definitely hang out sometime. I know my viewers would love it, and I think it'd be great. I'm a long-time subscriber of your channel. You have great stuff. So with that said, thank you all for watching. Please subscribe, and don't forget to stay sharp.